doing during this?
I'm good. Are you from Ireland by any chance?
Yeah, I'm from Ireland. Dave is also from Ireland. Yes, we're
Yes.
both Irish.
We're
boys.
both Irish boys.
Whereabouts?
I'm from Cork, and Dave is from.
I'm from Limerick.
Oh, do they get do you guys get along? Cork and Limerick?
Not really, no.
Not really.
But we get along.
We get along, yeah.
Peachy.
No, my mother's my mother's from Glasgow. She grew up in Scotland. So when you're in Scotland, it's like you're like, why would I go to Ireland? It's like it's too similar.
Sure,
of course.
Rain everywhere all the time.
Rain everywhere. They're a little more uptight in Scotland, but lovely, right?
Yeah,
lovely people.
Yeah.
They're not. I mean, at least they're not English. God.
Yes.
Right.
Exactly. That's the key.
So, John,
go ahead.
You're a born Texan.
Well, my dad was an army guy, so
Yes.
I was just there for 3 months to be born.
To be born, right?
It was the base is like a, kids in cages, detainment center, which is humiliating. But I moved. I lived in like 15 places, till I came of age, and then. And a couple of years in Scotland. I was in boarding school in Scotland, actually.
That's where you did your first play, right? Or your first performance?
I was the Virgin Mary.
Virgin Mary. Tell us about that.
Well, she was the mother of Jesus.
I think
she had
allegedly.
She had 2 lines in the Bible.
Yes.
For someone who was so important, she just was given 2 lines.
Right.
The first one was, "But how, if I'm a virgin?" And the second was 33 years later, which was, "Jesus, they're out of wine." And that tells her story.
Wow.
Brilliant.
Is there any VHS tape or anything of your performance in that?
Well, that was 1973, so
probably not.
No. But I was the music. It was a boys' school, and I don't know if you guys went to boys' schools, but
yes. Yeah.
You did.
Yeah.
I mean, there was no shame in
I didn't.
dressing up as.
Yeah.
You didn't,
No.
but it was actually not uncool to do plays and dress up as the girl, right?
Sure, you got a lot of abuse for it. I don't know if you did. But.
I didn't, because I didn't get any. And in fact, it was like the best soprano had to do that. When you're 10, it was not a big deal.
Right.
There was some, I don't even remember any winks or laughs, even though I did sing about her breasts, which was probably.
do you remember the lyrics? Do you remember?
Yes, it was "Sleep, holy babe, sleep, holy babe, upon thy mother's breast.
Brilliant.
How sweet it is to see thee lie up in such a place of rest." It was a Benedictine nightmare.
Right.
Avoided molestation by the, skin of my teeth.
Thank God.
You were a military brat.
Is that a fair description? Yeah.
Yes, we lived all over Germany, all over the States, Scotland, and generally shitty places, but it teaches you to kind of be adaptable and I always think of the American military as a socialist state for rednecks, because you get everything you need if you do your job.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And they forget that socialism actually does work in the U.S. And so there's an open-mindedness about everyone's from somewhere else. It's macho.
Yes.
You don't lose, they didn't lose that, but there is a sense of like, doesn't matter where you're from. It's more like, what do you got to bring, to the party or the war.
Right. So did you know at an early age that you could sing and dance?
Well, there was Scotland, playing the Virgin Mary was my first singing role. And I loved that, the Scottish country dancing and the, the old songs, Donald, where's your trousers, and the paper, and all that.
Nice accent.
I'm going to be playing in a podcast that was based on an American radio serial for kids called The Cinnamon Bear. And The Cinnamon Bear was patio cinnamon, and he was terrible Irish accent, that they used. And I'm like, I can do a bad Irish. They're like, he's Paddy McCinnamon now. So we're doing a reboot. So I get to use my. I'm not sure if I should go full Glaswegian or something more fairies in the Highlands.
Fair play. Yeah, no, that's a great accent. So where did you go to high school?
Well, there were two. There's one in Albuquerque. Weirdly, I just found out that a couple of years ago, I found out I was at school with Mike Judge, of Beavis and Butthead fame.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
He was a year ahead of me, and we've connected by text and such, but we've never met. And we had a really cool, crypto lesbian drama teacher.
Nice.
Pat Heron, who taught me. My first play at school was a Pinter play.
Oh.
The birthday party, which
yes,
is
of course.
very Irish, yeah. and so there was a strange. We were both, in this very small Catholic school, but it was kind of radical, So we were both set off on our journeys from there. And then I was also in school in Kansas, Junction City, where Hedwig lives, in the story.
Sure. And after that, you went to college in Western University.
Yeah, didn't quite graduate, but had some great teachers. And Chicago was, the big theater town in the 80s, Steppenwolf Theater and all these great companies.
Right.
And was already acting in school, professionally in school, and played Huck Finn there. And then that kind of led to an understudy in a Huck Finn musical on Broadway in '85. So I moved to New York before I graduated.
Right. And it seemed like you were working like pretty consistently, like you mentioned. Like, did you have much day jobs?
I didn't. I was really lucky. I was in college and already, there was enough work. All those teen movies, John Hughes movies were starting up there, and there was a lot of work. And my first paid job was, at a Renaissance fair, doing Shakespeare parodies. We did 12 Shakespeare murderers. It was 12 murders in 12 minutes.
Right.
We did like all the murders, and and it was in Wisconsin. It was ridiculous. But, one of the guys who I was with there, Dennis O'Hare, is a famous actor, and he ended up playing my dad in my podcast musical, Anthem Homunculus.
Oh, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Cool.
So Northwestern really, really formed me. I always had great teachers. So by the time I got to the bullshit of Hollywood or this or that, I already had standards. So I, was like the 23-year-old that would be like, no.
Brilliant. Well, that kind of leads us on nicely to.
Well, so you left college to do a show on Broadway, is that right?
Yes, as an understudy.
So you were a star.
I was an understar.
Right.
But that was great. It was perfect. No one should be a star too soon before they're going to handle it.
Okay. Could you handle it?
I will wish that upon my enemies. Early stardom. It'll destroy them faster than anything else. So I was, I learned the power of. I don't want to do that because it's not good. But I also was lucky enough to be working and actually never had a day job, except not that I'm proud of it, because it's just chance. But
we're so jealous.
I know it was really weird, but it was because I was coming up, at a time when all the teen movies were happening, so I was able to, get an agent fast.
Sure. Tell us more about the bullshit of Hollywood, like how you experienced. You did some TV and film.
Yeah, well, it was like. I was also coming out into myself when AIDS hit, and so I was always, people were like, well, you're going to have to go in the closet for your career. And I was like, fuck you. It's like, you can tell me how to act, but don't tell me how to live my life.
Right.
And if someone doesn't want to cast me because I'm gay or something, I don't want to work with them.
Mm-hmm.
So I was pretty clear about that. I think it was because of the mortality of what was happening. It was just felt very selfish to be in the closet, or to, not speak up. And I didn't make a big deal out of it, but, I'd wear my, silence equals death pin in auditions. And weirdly, one job I auditioned for this movie, Book of Love, the character was very homophobically written, and the director didn't really sense that, because it was, that time when, an Asian actor would be a crazy stereotype, and, the gays were the same. So, or the Irish was drunk and the gay was silly,
Sure.
or whatever, the usual.
Yeah.
And I just said, I don't really think I want to be part of it the way it's written. And he was like shocked, that an actor would actually say that. And I said, he said, well, why is it? I said, it's kind of homophobic. He said, well, it's homoerotic. And I'm like, another word that begins with homo is homogenous. And they all mean different things.
Yes.
And this is, a stupid pedophile joke. And then it was just every stupid thing in the same character. It wasn't even consistent. And then he rewrote it. He couldn't really deal with it as a gay character. So I ended up doing it. It was a straight character. And then 15 years later, he went to see me in Hedwig off Broadway. And he was the head of New Line Cinema.
Wow.
So he let me direct. He fully financed the film and let me direct it the way I wanted. He was also doing, Lord of the Rings, but he was kind of my, benefactor in that case. And it was all because back then I was honest with him, not in a fuck you way, but just like, this could be better. This is not, So I always encourage, young actors to, find their craft, but also, and find their heroes, but also not, just don't do anything, like if something doesn't feel quite right, be good to yourself. You're not a whore, there's nothing wrong with sex work, but it's like, this has got to be something you love too. And we can learn from terrible situations, but we don't want to do another terrible situation. Right? When you're young, you try everything, but then that's in order to avoid the terrible thing that you experienced, and it actually leads to people respecting you as well, as long as you're not always saying no. I'm doing a show now, Shrill, which was really just for the money and to pay for my mom's health care and all of this. And it turned out to be a really good show, and it's my bread and butter while I do my non-lucrative other things.
Could you, because you mentioned your mom there, could you talk a bit more about how she influenced you? She was an art teacher, right?
She was an artist, a teacher. She was the brave one, came across the Atlantic in the 50s and taught in Montreal and then Chicago, met my dad in Colorado, and was very vibrant and, a go-getter, and but also very victim-y, like things were always happening to her instead of, to everyone. And so she would get very upset, things would often end in tears, whatever project it was, and my dad would have to calm her down. But she was super empowering, like you can do stuff, she wasn't very maternal. She was, that Scottish kind of thing where you don't touch your children. Right. You've been through the war, and I never saw a banana till I was 12. So what the hell do you want the card for? And so there was a lot of that guilt. And then, so Scottish and Catholic, which was,
Nice.
Which, I don't know, I guess it was a little softer than Scottish Protestant, right? Because Protestants don't really have loopholes.
Yeah.
Right. The Catholics always had a way out of this, right? Confession.
Right. Yeah.
All of these, there's always an annulments, right? It's like they've been around long enough to, be able to have loopholes. Protestants, though, nothing cute, nothing, just get on with it. It's a sin to have sex standing up because it could lead to dancing and all that. So she was artistically empowering, not very affectionate.
Right. Okay.
But even in high school, we had this horrible teacher, priest who was a principal who did molest people. I found out later, who canceled theater. You know, it was very footloose. You know, we're canceling dancing and theater because it could lead to something. And
Yeah.
I single-handedly got him to, you know, rescind that order. But then all the teachers hated him, so no one wanted to direct. So I had to get my mom to direct the Noel Coward play that I wanted done, and then she didn't give me the part I wanted, so I created a monster.
Which play was that?
Hay Fever.
Oh, classic, yeah, great stuff.
Yeah, I wanted to play the older gentleman, and she cast me as the young faggot, so she knew better.
Fair play. So I shouldn't assume anything, but regards to religion, I guess you rejected it, like you were.
Yeah, I mean, it's still in you. Did you guys have religion growing up?
Sure, like traditional
Okay.
Catholic.
But was it full on?
I mean,
You know,
Yeah, mass, confession, communion,
yeah.
all that.
Yeah,
You know,
all the way.
Guilt.
Yeah.
Guilt.
Guilt. Yeah.
Yeah. None of us were molested,
You know.
thankfully.
Well,
Oh, yeah?
I don't recall being molested.
I mean, they say a lot of good artists were lapsed Catholics, but
Yes.
it seems like they would have been an easier way.
Yeah.
But I still, even later in life, I kind of welcome some of the things I learned, especially the helping people out thing, the good works thing.
Mm-hmm.
Protestants got rid of the gay parts of the church, right? They got rid of Jesus on the cross, got rid of Mary, got rid of the saints, and got rid of the pretty stuff, right?
Right.
The gay stuff.
Yeah.
So I'm still happy I'm part of that, because all of the pageantry and the is in my work, and it's very draggy. It's a very gay religion.
Yeah,
Sure.
So there are good parts of it. And if you go way back, the early Christians were quite radical and quite communist. It was all about community, and it was, I'm a big fan of the Gnostic Christian Gospels, which were cut from the Bible, that like the Gospel of Thomas, which had these radical things like, when you make the male and female into the same, then you will enter the kingdom. And it's like stuff that never made it in the Bible, which really could have used it.
Right.
And that stuff influenced actually Hedwig, because Tommy Gnosis was believed that, he talked about the creator God as a very micromanaging, horrible God of the Old Testament, and then Eve was actually the positive force, who wanted knowledge, and she was connected to Sophia, who was the real God's mother. And so all of that stuff is definitely in my work. So it's just through a different prism.
Right. Were you a voracious reader in the younger days?
Yes, a massive, in boarding school, it was my great comfort. And it was, of course, the classic fantasy and, science fiction and Watership Down. And but I also liked Enid Blyton and liked, John Masefield. I liked all of the British and Irish, the tales and the myths.
Right, fairy tales, yeah.
Which of course influenced, all of fantasy, and science fiction. And I'm actually hoping to, write a kind of a sci-fi novel.
Cool.
The next few years.
And you got a lot of TV roles when you moved to New York. Interesting ones.
Yeah.
You were on MacGyver.
Well, yeah, we love MacGyver.
That was in LA.
Oh, okay.
We're in a very MacGyver time, aren't we? So how are we going to figure out how to cut our hair and, with a rubber band and a pair of scissors. Was
your scene with
Did you meet MacGyver?
Richard Dean Anderson?
Yes. His hair was very frosted.
He had great hair.
Yes, he had wonderful hair. He could do anything. That was fun. So I was doing, after a short time in New York, I went to LA for 4 years in the 80s. I actually found a guy here. I'm in Palm Springs. I found a guy. This is my first haircut. I just finished it.
Nice.
Since
Great
COVID.
Good job, yeah.
But, there's, as you might know, there's a kind of, in the COVID, like, well, I know a hair cutter.
Right.
You might do it. It feels it feels very Jewish ghetto under the occupation. I found someone who can, get you a piece of fish. So, what was the question? Oh yeah, I moved to LA and was doing theater doing like tape theater at the Taper, and then TV guest shots, and then hanging out at these underground queer clubs, which my hairdresser today was remembering the specific ones because he grew up there.
Right. And can you recall any of their names? What kind of?
Well, yeah. I mean, my DJ mother, in a way, was because I like to DJ, was Billy Limbo, and he had a crazy kind of night called Limbo Lounge where it was like really extreme stuff. I remember a drag queen with hardcore cerebral palsy in a wheelchair just screaming.
Whoa.
And there was this incredible punk rock drag queen named Vaginal Cream Davis, who is actually a doctor now. She's Dr. Vag.
Wow. Is she a gynecologist?
She's not a gynecologist. She's like 6'5", black, built like a linebacker from the Valley, talks
Grace
like a white girl. Yeah, but more kind of gigantic. And she was very punk rock and very Valley. And her band that I remember at that time was called Black Fag.
Wow.
Yeah, she was serious. And I love her very much. And she, so the Queens and the underground in LA was different from New York or San Francisco or Dublin because they really had Hollywood to react to. New York was already cool, so it was like everybody was sort of cool. So it was tended to be more, arty. The CBGB's thing was, kind of a mixed bag, but it tended to be people who really wanted to make something new, as opposed, and they were reacting to, dinosaur rock too, of course. But in LA, there was, when punk hit LA, it was kind of more extreme. It was like the British or Irish side. It'd be like the Undertones or the, what was the other great Northern Irish band?
Lips.
Stiff Little Fingers.
Stiff Little Fingers.
Yeah. And they, they had a political agenda. Often the British and the Irish had the political underclass. Yeah. They were a little arty too, but it got, in LA it was like it was the trashier kids that were into it. New York, it was sort of cooler. And so you got the more extreme bands like Fear and, amazing bands who could somehow make fun of New York. It was unheard of because LA was so uncool. And so when I was there, I see these really radical people who were, they were like, fuck Hollywood and making fun of it and being more intense than other places. So in the 80s, and, bands came out of that scene like, A Jane's Addiction and what's their name? Red Hots and those guys.
Right.
But it was very queer and gothy. Goth was very LA.
Yeah. Were you in a band yourself around that time, or were you just focused on acting?
No, I was. I had done some of these musicals, but I was always a little afraid to. I knew I'd have to rush off and do something, so it was hard to commit to even having a dog, or cutting my hair because I would have to do something to it later. So I would play punks, in shows, on TV shows, but I wasn't a real one, But I got really into queer punk music, and of course, Bowie, Iggy, and Lou were, my heroes. But it all kind of came. I sort of discovered them more after I came out, whereas in Chicago, before I was kind of more into folkier and, Joan Armatrading, Ricky Lee Jones, Tom Waits, Bonnie Raitt, more blues. I was really into Muddy Waters, and then later I got, Bowie, and I mean, I grew up with glam rock too. So Top of the Pops, you'd see remember seeing him do Gene Genie and scared me a lot. And,
Mhm.
but, there was a million, everybody was wearing makeup at that time, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
But he seemed like he meant it. It was not a joke.
Right.
Right.
And what was it like being in that scene in LA during Ronald Reagan's administration?
Well, it was AIDS time, and it was the horror of, you can't imagine it today. A president who doesn't give a shit.
Mm.
Can you
Right.
imagine such a thing about death or disease? And I remember Bob Hope making some joke, like fag jokes about AIDS,
Mm.
and Reagan laughing.
Right.
It was just like that was the way it was. And so punk and queerness was connected then, and it was very much, we wanted him dead because he wanted us dead.
Sure.
Right. Sure.
And those establishment gays who were getting sick, Freddie Mercury and Rock Hudson and Liberace, who couldn't even come out,
Yeah.
and took their secret to the grave,
Right.
was sad too. It's like
Yeah.
how cowardly, how
Yeah.
pathetic, and so we were a different generation. I'm actually reading a really great book called The Great Believers, which was more about Chicago in the 80s when I was in Chicago for college. But it's all coming back. And, you had a sense of humor you'd have to laugh about the horror. And, the going joke then was, what's the hardest part about getting AIDS? It's like trying to convince your parents that you're Haitian,
Right.
Wow.
Right.
It was just so tied up with guilt. And even the people who got AIDS would start to believe that it was their own fault.
Right.
They drank the Kool-Aid. And there were weird new age people like Louise Hay in LA who were also saying, you're making yourself sick. You can
Oh.
make yourself clean, and it was like, fuck you.
Right.
Right.
Give me some fucking drugs.
Yeah. So there was a lot of anger in your community at that time. Yeah.
A lot of anger, a lot of art, a lot of despair. And Hedwig kind of came out of the end of that era.
Right. We'll get to that in a second, but I guess it's kind of connected. I just want to I'd like you to talk about the German influence, because you speak German fluently, am I correct? Or
No, I speak a bit.
have you performed in German or no?
No, I've sung some songs in German, but in fact, the finale of Hedwig was actually a German translation of You Light Up My Life.
Oh, wow.
I'm glad we changed that. Interestingly, Joe Brooks, that You Light Up My Life was the biggest hit of the 70s in the US.
Yes.
And Joe Brooks, this guy wrote it, and he reviewed Hedwig. I think we looked into getting the rights for the show, and he didn't think we were wholesome enough for his song. And then 10 years later, he was indicted on 40 counts of rape.
Wow. There you go.
There you go.
Wholesome.
Yeah.
I don't think he was wholesome enough either.
No.
Apparently not. Wow.
Yeah. So the awareness of hypocrisy and the awareness of sociopathy and just a lack of empathy was always there for anyone who's an outsider. It exists.
Yeah.
You hope to not become destroyed by it or embittered.
Yeah.
Or I'm a victim forever. You don't want to stay in that place.
Yeah.
But you also have to acknowledge what happened. And even when Reagan and Bush and those people died, it was these sort of encomiums and like, weren't they amazing? And it was like, he allowed hundreds of thousands of people to die.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
And he's being lauded for what? A tax cut? It's like, give me a fucking break.
Sure.
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 I mean, of course, now I'd prefer him to what we have now, of course.
Sure.
Right.
Were you into Brecht? Was Brecht an influence?
He wasn't. It wasn't really, but I lived in Germany when I was young. My father was the military commander of Berlin before the wall came down,
Mm-hmm.
and so I was always interested. I loved expressionism. I liked, in painting, I liked the weirdness, the grotesquerie. I liked, a couple years before I wrote Hedwig, I saw uh, a seminal stage piece by Robert Wilson, William Burroughs, and Tom Waits called The Black Rider.
Okay.
And it was unbelievable. It showed me that a musical can be anything as long as it has songs and a story. And Burroughs was always a hero, and Waits, and I admired Robert Wilson. So that made me, and it was very expressionist, a lot of white faces and black, white, black, and very Weimar. And so that rubbed off a little bit on Hedwig. But Hedwig is also that, through the lens of Midwestern 70s, her hair was based on, my childhood friend,
Right.
Stacey Orr. And it was, so there were tons of army wives, often Korean, Filipina, or German, a couple of Brits. I don't think we had an army base in Ireland, but there was, these wives would, marry to get the hell out, and then they divorce fairly quickly, but they would still orbit the army bases and work as babysitters or in the PX, or in her case as a prostitute, who was my brother's babysitter.
Wow.
Her name was Helga. So she was a visual kind of inspiration for Hedwig.
Wow. Yeah. So, like, regarding Hedwig, before that was created, your masterpiece, I think it's fair to call it.
Yes.
You were working a lot as an actor. You were nominated for a lot of cool stuff off Broadway and awards. I think you won a couple of things. I guess my question is, like, I often hear well-known people talking about their masterpieces as like it came out of necessity because they just like they have to get it out of them for whatever reason. They might have been economically fucked or whatever. But I don't like. I'm just wondering, did Hedwig come out of necessity? Like it was just something inside you that you have to get out? Or?
I mean, I was a traditional actor. I was doing traditional shows and learning from them. And often they would be really good, like 6 Degrees of Separation, or this
right.
play by Larry Kramer called The Destiny of Me, which was really a big deal. And I liked being in the secret garden and such, but I also would be bored, and I wanted to improvise more. I wanted the freedom of rock and roll, the freedom of drag, the freedom of stand-up. These were forms that I admired but didn't do.
Right.
So, and I felt something at music, at show concerts that I didn't feel in the theater, and I thought it should be the same feeling. So I wanted to make something that was really rock, authentic, not a theater version. Like I admire Rent, but the music just doesn't speak to me. It's not rock and roll. It's pretending to be early 80s rock and roll, and it's not.
Right.
And Tommy or Hair could have great songs, but they didn't have a great story. There was no real story there.
Sure.
So I thought you could take the story, you could take the forms of drag, stand-up, punk, and put them into a traditional Broadway type musical story, and they would work with each other. They didn't need to be at odds, and in fact they would. I wanted to bring the theater folks to the rock and the music people to Broadway, and when you do something new like that, it's very hard to get an audience because most of marketing is comparing to something, and we didn't have anything to compare to, and Rocky Horror wasn't quite right. So we barely survived off Broadway with the help of journalists, and then stars started coming. And people who didn't like musicals started coming, but we never made any money. We just sort of hung on. And then there was this strange moment of being able to make a film I wanted. There was a weird bidding war, which doesn't happen anymore, for small films. And small films are out of fashion now. But there was a kind of lucky moment that I could direct something, and I'd never directed any kind of film before. So it was really a big deal. So we developed, Stephen Trask and I, the composer, developed it at first at a rock and roll drag club called Squeezebox, because we wanted to keep it out of the theaters. We wanted to keep it with the people in the clubs and the energy. And that was really smart. And so for like 4 years, we do gigs off and on while we were writing what became the musical, which came out in, the first version was in 97. So, and the 90s were pretty rockin', like Nirvana had kicked off a whole decade of often good music that sort of devolved into Linkin Park.
Or Korn.
Right, or Creed.
Wow. I've been very catty.
And then young people turned away from the guitar very quickly in the 2000s. But rock and roll will come back,
Yes.
I'm so sad to think, today Little Richard, passed away.
Oh, we're going to ask you about that because I saw on your Instagram, like you made a lovely note, and do you want to talk a bit about him?
Well, the first thrill of rock and roll that I experienced was listening to him doing, I think it was first the Beatles version of Long Tall Sally, and then I heard the original, and I was like, oh my God.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It was so different from the Chuck Berry, which was kind of easygoing compared to pure punk. He was the first punk.
Right.
And the first punk was a femme gay man, who grew up one of 12, poor black kid from Georgia. And I was like, damn, I wish I'd known him. He, would turn away from rock and from homosexuality, but he never was judgy about it. It was just, I think he overdid it himself, like any sexual addict or whatever had to. And he separated it from the other folks who, turn to God and then denounce what they were and who they are. He was very loving.
Uh-huh.
And all the people that I admire look to him, more than the other, originators of rock, more than Elvis and Chuck Berry. The David Bowie says it's all about Little Richard.
Right.
He even mentored the Beatles a bit and the Stones, and of course Prince, Michael Jackson. James Brown worked for him, Hendrix worked for him, Joe Tex worked for him, and he's not shy, and he wasn't shy about saying, I am the queen of rock and roll. And it was like that pride and that humor. Tonight I'm going to scream like a white woman. That was, one of the beginnings of Hedwig, for sure.
Right. Well, he was fearless.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's
Fierce.
inspiring. Yeah.
Yeah. And he wasn't smart. Little Richard ended up not making the money that Chuck Berry, put my money in a bag before I start singing. He was all about the money, and Little Richard was about the fun, and that tripped him up,
Yeah.
Not to mention being black and getting ripped off.
Sure. It seems with Hedwig, like you kind of fuse the personal with the fantasy beautifully. Is that fair to say? Like there's some personal elements in there, and it's.
Yeah, it's more emotionally personal. Obviously the character is very different from me, and some people have said, "Oh, it's a trans story that you told very early." I'm like, I don't see it as a trans story at all. I think of it as, because the kid was comfortably feminine gay guy. He was forced into an operation,
Right.
by his horrible boyfriend, his mother, and his government. In effect, by the binarchy.
Right.
Saying, well, you have to be this in order to be free, and you're going to be a man, it has to be this, and cut that off. And he's trying to conform to the patriarchy to free himself, and ends up being mutilated. There's nothing. Trans involves agency and choice and free. A kind of going towards the light, where this was like, the darkness engulfed and almost destroys the character, who is now identified as a woman, whether he liked it or not. And it's only through in the song Wig in a Box, he discovers at his lowest point that there is this wig, there's this makeup, there's this music that is going to save him, and he's never going to look back. And it's like, okay, I'm a woman, but I'm deciding what woman I'm going to be. And then at the end, so the armor of what is Hedwig becomes very strong, and in fact becomes a bit of a coffin later, and the bitterness and the victimhood, is starting to curdle behind the mask. And at the end of the story, in frustration and the betrayals of her lover, Hedwig rips the drag off, which I saw happen, on stage at Squeezebox with this queen, Mistress Formica, who was incredible. And ripping it off rips the armor off.
Right.
And then this person who's no longer, who's, as we all are, a gender of one.
Yes, indeed.
In the end, we're a gender of one. It's what we make of it. I don't believe as much in the binary stuff, so I think everybody has male and female, what we might call male female energies. And if you suppress them, any of them, it's like an animal dying in the wall.
Right.
It smells the place up.
Right. Sure.
And we all know that. We all know the people who aren't comfortable with who they are, and they're crushing something down, and they're not fun to hang out with.
Absolutely, yeah. Not that we pay too much heed to these people, but how did the critics receive Hedwig originally off Broadway? Like, was it positive?
It was positive, yeah. I mean, there was a few kind of heterosexist kind of gay people are so funny. There was a few of those. But generally, it was good. And the film was very well received too.
Yeah.
But it was a flop. And Off Broadway was not a big one.
You won Best Director at Sundance, right?
Yes, it was a success d'estime,
right?
In French, which means but can you eat it?
Okay,
right.
Yeah, so I was very respected.
Cult classic. Sorry, it's become a cult classic ever since.
Yeah. So you were ahead of your time, kind of.
Because of the DVD.
Right. So did you guys recoup some of that money?
No.
That? Okay.
Oh man. Wow.
No. Yeah. It's not enough money to sue, and it's a whole thing.
Right.
But when we finally got to Broadway, because Broadway wasn't really ready for us back then, and things changed, and we finally were on Broadway in 2014, and we made money there. I made money replacing Neil Patrick Harris. Which is great. It's always better to replace because you don't have to do as much press and stuff.
Right.
And we'll still do it in London, the West End at some point.
Hopefully.
And it's, everybody does it, and I love it. It's never been something that has paid my bills, but that's okay.
That's so interesting because it's been translated so many times. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Well, it's very popular in Korea and Japan also.
Yeah.
Yes. I'm not sure why. I mean, maybe slightly, I'm not sure. I mean, there's a kind of a manga thing in Japan where, she seems like a kind of cartoon anime character.
Uh-huh.
And there's also a tradition of young women obsessed with gay men in love.
Right. Right. Of course.
The manga is called yaoi. Yeah. And there's actually a famous popular animated TV show called Yuri on Ice about ice skaters. It's very queer. That one of the characters is based on me.
Right.
Victor. So there's this kind of, foreigner, gay, exotic, so somehow it worked. Korea, I think that a lot of it has to do with, it's maybe even more popular in Korea. It's been playing there for 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
And it's in every Korean karaoke, you can find it. And I think that's partly because of the divided country.
Right. Oh, yes.
Hedwig has the, East and West Germany. And so I think that metaphor is very strong. And in fact, a famous K-pop band sort of stole the title Origin of Love and used the two halves animation thing. And
wow.
I know, it was really weird. It was as if, it was as if, Lady Gaga suddenly did it and pretended like no one had done it before, you know, so it was a little weird.
Yeah.
Wouldn't put it past you.
What was it like collecting your Tony in 2015?
It was good though, you know, because I was always a bit on the fringe. I had a jaundiced view of these awards because, you know, is this really the best movie of the year because it won the Oscar? No, it's one that had a campaign behind it. There, you know, there might have been some stars. Lately, more interesting films were able to win best, you know, like Moonlight and stuff, and not have to have a star in it, because the voting, the voters are changing too. But so I was always, I would never, you know, turn down an award. I wouldn't be a, you know, a David Bowie and turn down a knighthood. But I would also point to the, you know, the hypocrisy and the fact that it doesn't really, Grammys does not mean the best music of the year, right?
Of course.
It's the best popular music, you know, with a budget for promotion behind it.
Right.
And sometimes it's good. So when I got a Tony, it was a special Tony because I had replaced, you know, I was a replacement. You know, people like Bette Midler would get them for doing unusual things, or, you know, that it felt perfect, you know, and because I moved so much as a kid, I don't feel like I belong very strongly in any one group.
Yeah.
And in fact, like Woody Allen would say, I don't want to be in a club that wants me as a member. You know, it's like I learn and I can enjoy being in theater or film or television, but I always don't feel like I'm part of one community.
Right.
I'm part of my friends' community. I certainly support downtown cabaret and unusual film, but I don't. So the awards, you know, I think mean more to people who feel fully part of that community. You know, I just feel like it's a wonderful compliment.
Right.
Yeah, I feel like back in the 1980s when you were performing and when you were part of that queer movement, that it took a lot of courage and bravery to kind of to fight the, I guess, the prevailing culture. But
I never felt like the brave one. I wasn't the guy who would go to the marches. I was scared of that.
Okay.
I would do it in my own quiet way. It was more personal and interaction. But like I even felt guilty as not being the one, you know, at the ACT UP marches and getting arrested and stuff, because I was too weedy for that. And you know, I really admired the warriors, you know.
Right.
And the warriors are often people who hated their parents.
okay.
You know, for better or worse. You know, I always think that arch liberal and the arch conservative both got shit on by their dad, but the only difference was the conservative thought he deserved it.
Right. Interesting.
You know, so it's that you know, the extremity that forces the change, and the revolutionaries often had the problem in their family too.
Yeah.
For better or worse. But my family wasn't that bad that I was like, fuck you. You know, I wasn't, I didn't have that kind of fire. I was more of a quiet, I think we can do better. And this is not very good. And, you know, it's like, let's make it better somewhat within the system though, you know. But if someone wanted me out, I was quite happy to be out and go off and do something of my own. And I certainly got fired from things too.
Right.
We both enjoyed Short Bus.
Yeah. I saw it in 2006 in the Kino Cinema, an art house cinema in Cork City, and it blew my mind. I was like, this is like fucking, I hope you don't mind comparisons being flippant, but Cassavetes-esque, you know.
I love Cassavetes.
So it's like Cassavetes for queers, like I mean that in a good way, you know what I mean? Like,
yes.
But it was very universal.
I can't believe it played there.
It did very well. Like
wow.
that cinema's now closed, unfortunately, but
that was the art cinema?
Yeah, it was the only art house cinema in Cork, like just would play like 2 movies. And, yeah.
Did they have one in Limerick?
No, I saw it recently.
Oh yeah, but did you have a art house theater in Limerick though?
We had a small theater in Limerick, but it wasn't really arty. It was very kind of Terminator 2,
right.
Lethal Weapon 4, you know, Free Willy 3, Willy Daddy.
All the numbers.
Yeah.
Yeah, that Short Bus was kind of Free Willy too.
Okay.
But,
Um,
talk to us about the process there, because like you were very, I believe you were quite adamant about having no stars in that movie, in quotes.
well, I wasn't against it. It's just that stars are very afraid of sex.
Sure.
Although, everyone has a sex tape now. It's kind of an accessory. But back then, it would end a career, and the only people who were names who auditioned tended to be former child stars who were like, "I'm punk now."
Right.
All those Macaulay Culkins and Joseph Gordon-Levitt's.
Corey Feldman.
Yeah.
And Haley Joel Osment want to do the craziest shit now because they're like, I'm not a little baby. I'm not a baby. I'm Butch or I'm crazy.
I think he did
all
a
of Leonardo.
Yeah.
I mean, all of Leonardo DiCaprio. I feel like all of Leonardo DiCaprio's roles since Titanic are, I'm not a little twink. I'm a tough guy. I'm getting butcher. I'm blowing up.
Yeah.
I liked him better when he was a little fag.
Yeah, what's he? Gilbert Grape, yeah.
He was great. He was.
Yeah, he was.
So for me, it was who is up for this journey? Who's up for challenging themselves sexually, but also has something to say and is not in it just to be an exhibitionist. But so I asked anyone could audition. They sent in a VHS of themselves talking about an emotionally important sexual experience. And sometimes they acted it out. Sometimes they just told the story. And I chose 40 of the most interesting. They came under their own steam to New York. I showed them a good time. We had parties. We had a game of spin the bottle with 100 people. We did improv. They had to also anonymously say who they thought was hot in the group because I had to get couples together.
Nice.
And luckily I cast a gay couple that was already a couple, and the straight couple weren't. And by the time we shot, they were really not into each other. But it's like it wasn't about that. It wasn't about hotness or turning on the audience or the characters. It was about their various own disconnections with themselves and others. It was just sex was the realm that showed itself. It seemed silly that porn. It seemed silly that sex, which was so complex, was just porn had the only dibs on it. And it was too complicated for porn. I like good porn, but it was, there's nothing real about it. And I think and nowadays, people younger than us see hardcore porn years before they have sex, and it kind of warps them. It doesn't not makes them into perverts, but they can't perform because they're imitating it.
Yes.
See it in their head too much, and it's like, I'm supposed to do this and followed by that, and then there's a facial, and then she's going to scream when she orgasms, and then I'll scream at the same time. And it's like, honey, that scream is not real.
Right.
Bring a gay man into the room. He'll tell you whether she's coming or not. And it was just, it was kind of a reaction to that commodification, that formalization of sex, which, and fewer young people are having sex. And I think it's because of porn and because of the internet. It's so messy, and the reality of it, let's just jerk off and get on with it. And the Japanese have been like that for the last 10 years. Their sex rights have plummeted among young people, and it's not good. It's not healthy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, maybe you could talk a little bit about directing other people's stuff, what attracts you. I mean, you will go down in history as being, I guess, the last person to direct Phil Hoffman as well.
Yeah. That sadly was not a great experience. I mean, he was in extremis, and would be really sweet and then really bullying and begged me to do it, and then didn't treat me well. We got through it, and we had one beautiful moment where I thought there should be a completely improvised scene at the end of the episode. It was a pilot called Happy-ish.
Yes, right.
Written by Shalom Auslander, who's great, but he was new, and so he couldn't really protect me from Phil. But I wanted to improvise a scene with him and Catherine Hahn where they're just, I just turned the camera on, I played them some music, and they're making cookies and talking about the day. And it was a 20-minute shot, just 2 cameras, one light. And one of the lights went out and they were going to cut. And I was like, don't you cut for a minute, because it was going really well. And then he burst into tears. And I think I was playing music for him to give them a feeling, you know, and I played the Velvet Underground. And then at a key moment, I played what I knew was his favorite song.
Which is?
Which is An Irishman.
Oh, the Pogues? No?
Well, no, it was Van.
Van
Morrison.
And I played Sweet Thing.
Oh, beautiful.
Which, you know,
yeah.
which will melt anybody.
Of course. Yeah.
And he just broke down, and it was the most beautiful thing. And after we hugged, and he was very grateful, but he was gone 3 months later.
Oh, man.
Yeah. So I do love working on other people's stuff. I love to be a script doctor.
How was Rabbit Hole? Sorry.
Rabbit Hole was good. I mean, it was not as pleasant in a different way, because one of the producers was very breathed down my neck as if I had never made anything before. So she was second guessing me a lot. Mm-hmm. But Nicole and I had a good relationship, and I really loved the story. I lost my brother when he was the same age as the character in the movie. Right. And so it was kind of, I sort of did it for my mom and my family. And my mom was very cold about her reaction, because she was so religious, and Nicole's character is not. And she was like, well, that's not the way we handled it. It's not the heathen way. But I really was proud of it, even though I didn't get to do everything I wanted to do, because I was a hire and not, it wasn't my film. I was still proud of it. And then, you know, so I do enjoy directing other people's stuff. I've directed other TV and some theater.
Yes.
And I also enjoy adapting, you know, and my last film was How to Talk to Girls at Parties, which was Neil Gaiman. Yeah. And that was really fun to take a small story and expand it, and, you know, work with all my favorite British actors and meet new young people.
Speaking of which, you seem to have a great eye for what's kind of, you know, going on right now, finger on the pulse with directing our friends Emily and Leah / that masterpiece. We hope
is that how you got my email?
That's how I know you. Yeah.
How do you know them?
I'm in Gigi. Have you watched Gigi, the web series?
Oh,
I'm like the asshole director. You'd love me.
Oh my God!
Check me out. Yeah.
Gotta check it out. Yeah. Well, they're right up my alley. I mean, and I'm up theirs.
Great clay.
He also used to be in love with Emily.
Oh, yeah. We used to be together. Back in the day. Yeah.
Oh. Well, they're so talented.
In the other room. Yeah. Yes.
And I can't wait to see what they're up to next. You know, I remember meeting, you know, Leah when she was a child through Danny Fields.
Yes.
You know, the great Danny Fields. And who's kind of her godfather.
Right. The man who's discovered Iggy Pop, right? And
yeah, there'd be no punk without him.
Right.
He signed he managed the Ramones, signed MC5. It's incredible, all the fags who made punk happen. But so Leah, yeah, I love them and I love their work. And I was trying to convince them to go to Edinburgh this year, but of course that.
Oh yeah, that situation. Yeah.
Could you tell us about being on the David Letterman show?
Oh yes.
Well, you know, he was a real weirdo. You know, you could see that he's uptight, but we were on there and you know, I was doing the rehearsal and they didn't want me to rip my wig off, you know, at the end of the song "Tear Me Down."
Oh right.
And they wouldn't say why. It was some guy in the booth who's like, "Please don't remove don't remove the wig." And I'm like, "Who are you and why?" You know what? Really, they didn't want controversy and they wanted people to think I was a woman.
Right. Oh my God.
Yeah, and they didn't interview us after. And in fact, when we finally shot it, I did rip the wig off. They said don't rip it off during the song, so I didn't. I ripped it off after the song, which they cut out.
Wow.
And then Dave, usually comes down and shakes everybody's hands.
Yeah.
Didn't do it. Didn't shake our hands.
Oh,
I think because I rebelled with the wig.
That's like, I was going to ask about like what you think about censorship in general, because of course you directed the music video for Scissor Sisters that was like banned by MTV Europe and all this stuff. Like, what's going on? What has changed?
I mean, that one we knew it would be because there's like tits flying through the air.
Right.
But
come on, when are we going to grow up?
I know. Come on. Europeans seem more okay with tits. And Eve, I don't know. Did Ireland have the page 3?
Oh, of course we did. Yeah.
We had page 3, but we didn't have Playboy until 1995.
Oh, didn't know that.
Did you have the tabloid that had the titty woman in the third page, like
yes,
the Sun?
The Sun, yeah, we did that. Yeah, that was fantastic.
It was fantastic. Yeah, it was definitely.
Yeah, especially when I was 15.
I know. Well, in boarding school in Scotland, even the monks would show it. Every film had tits in the 70s, so we'd had. Remember, all those Carry On films had tits.
Right.
But I somehow knew there was something more than tits. There was more out there for me.
Were you into the Carry On films? We loved the Carry On films.
I did as a kid. I mean, how can you not? And it's funny to realize the most heterosexual sex comedy was starring the biggest queen.
But Kenneth Williams is a genius.
Yes, and how could you not know he was a giant queen? He was quite good friends with Joe Orton, who was my hero.
I was going to bring that up, but talk more about Orton.
Yeah, I mean, Joe, again, like Little Richard, like Kenneth Williams, like Jean Genet, Burroughs, the real queer iconoclasts, Ginsberg, the people who were true originals and started huge movements just because they had nowhere else to go. It was a sense of, this is me, take me or leave me. Joe Orton was one of those, and he was like farting in the room of, farting in the House of Lords. He just hated. He was a working class lad. He hated the pretension of English, specifically English society, and the boredom of it and the grayness. And he came out with these insanely intellectual farces, that could work really low end humor and then really high end, and I always loved his. There was like a 6-line sequence from Loot where the undercover policeman reveals himself. I'm Truscott of the Yard. And they're like, And he goes, remember the case of the limbless girl killer. And there's a pause. And someone said, who would kill a limbless girl? She goes, she was the killer. And then there's another pause. And it's like, how did she do it? She was limbless. He goes, I'm not prepared to divulge that information. We don't want a carbon copy murder on our hands. And it was just like...
That was amazing. That's going to go viral, that little 30 seconds. Jeez.
Yeah.
Well, it was just every, he could just work every element. And he was always making fun of, the powers that be and the absurdity, which was easy to do then. But he was even crazy. The Beatles hired him, Brian Epstein hired him to write a screenplay. And he wrote them as cross-dressing terrorists and sent it in and heard no response. Too crazy for the Beatles.
That's great.
So I loved him, and I'm so sad that he died.
He's a genius. Could you speak to us about, are there any queer artists today that you admire, that you kind of go, wow, they're on?
There's a lot of great. I love Taylor Mack. I love Justin Vivian Bond.
Yes.
The more open things are, you're going to get more queer mediocrity. That's just the price of acceptance.
Sure.
And more queer Republicans and Milo Yiannopoulos and bullshit. But there's always, there's always a good breaking down the boundaries coming out of the queer corner, and it comes from other outsider corners too, of course, African American rap and shook things up, and Latino music, which is less in your face. If you're a minority, you generally have a culture you can draw on to develop your thing, and then show it to the mainstream, for better or worse, and hopefully change it for the better. And those are all the people we've been talking about tonight. And they continue. There's lots of great people, and the openness, the possibility of trans visibility is certainly opened that up.
Yeah.
I think it's going to lead more towards a non-binary thing, personally.
Yeah.
When you give in to what you're told as a kid, it's easier, but sometimes that's where conservatism comes from. It's a certain amount of laziness. And if you're an outsider, you can't afford to be lazy because you're sometimes threatened.
Right.
I was not as much. I had an easier time of it, but my heroes were the real outsiders, and they're still with us, thank God. Making changes. It's I'm hoping for the next generation of young people, the Generation Z, to be a bit more active than I think millennials were sometimes overwhelmed by the economic crisis.
Sure.
And 9/11 here. So there was a certain amount of what the hell, it's not what it was. I don't know. I'm barely hanging on my college or whatever, and Generation Z, there's a bit more, I think, coming up with the Trump era. There's a punker spirit that we could use, because the millennials, as they were floundering, kind of gave up the mantle of punk to the old people, the Tea Party people, the Trump people, who want to break things up, as their, and as their walker falls to the ground. And their version of breaking things up is very reactionary.
Sure.
But it's still as disruptive, as punk, but I'm hoping for young people who used to traditionally be the agents of change, to come back.
Yeah, well, me and Dave totally agree with the non-binary thing. We actually, personally, I'm really into the Indian gurus, and like, there is no man or woman,
Gender,
nothing or nothing. But just an anecdotal, we discovered that you're a big fan of The Wire.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yes.
What also a favorite?
We've been doing our research.
Favorite show.
There's a podcast that really breaks it down, isn't there?
That breaks down the Wire. There is a podcast that breaks down The Wire.
Yeah.
Well, we're huge fans. What attracts you to?
Were you watching it back in the old country, or was it here that you
watched it here?
I watched it here, actually. Yeah.
That's where you first watched it.
Yeah,
it's interesting because there's so much. They don't make it easy. The slang is so extreme for even people who are non-Baltimoreans.
Yeah.
So you kind of have to watch with the subtitles sometimes, even if you're American.
Yeah.
But there was this incredible mixture that David Simon and Ed Burns, who were the two people that made it, found, that was a combination of a real urban kind of agents of change, socialist minded kind of, this has got to be better, so there was always an anger about the way things are, but combined with an incredible facility to have a million characters. And they didn't get lost somehow. You keep coming back to them,
right,
even after a long time, and their story was still strong enough to follow. And it was, and Dickensian was the term, but it really was because of so many characters. It didn't have the Dickensian cheesiness of "you are my father," it would, but it did have the up from the bootstraps, and of course the kids were the ones that broke your heart. Like, which way are they going to go?
Right.
Who was your favorite character? throughout the 5 seasons.
Well, I mean, it's hard to say no to Omar, isn't it?
Omar.
Oh, yeah. Indeed.
Legend. Yes.
And I did get to meet him, and he was like Hedwig, and I was like, oh my God, Omar likes Hedwig.
Oh, wow.
He
Nice.
was so sweet, and yeah, he's a real activist guy. And but I loved. I thought everybody was great, even if you didn't like him. You know, Idris Elba's character, and
Oh, yeah.
Dominic West wasn't my favorite actor. I think the accent got it, kind of threw him a little bit.
Yeah.
So he was, you know, how he's a little, he's
Yeah.
a bit flatter in that than he is in other things.
Yeah.
But he had a good, you know, he had a bonhomie that was, you know, you still liked him, but I felt like the people around him were always better, you know. And Wendell Pierce was, you know, the star.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Absolute legend. What do you think, Dave? Have we covered?
Yeah.
Have we covered so much of what we wanted?
John,
to?
it's been great to meet you, and thanks for coming.
Yeah.
Could you wait for 1 second, John? Because my fiance, who has seen Hedwig 7 times, wants to say hello.
Okay.
Maybe we can stop the recording. But thank you so much.
Sure.
Appreciate
Where
it.
are you guys right now?